let's begin our study today with Genesis chapter 15, verses 12 through 16, where we see the affirmation of God's covenant with Abraham and a very interesting prophecy concerning 400 years of bondage in a foreign land. We'll begin again in chapter 15, verse 12. Now, when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he said, in other words, God said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, we start here because of the significance of the time that was spent in Egypt, that 400 years in bondage to someone else he referred to or prophesied here. During that time, Israel grew from a family to a great nation. You see, only a few went into Egypt. But when they left, there was a great multitude that left, millions strong. Now, why did they spend 400 years? Well, the answer given is that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, Rabbi Ishmar Shorsh gives this explanation in his work. It says, I confess, and I'm quoting, that the traditional commentaries are not much concerned with my question. The first answer I can find is the one given by the Torah itself. The land is not empty, and its inhabitants are not yet wholly unworthy of it, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, the explanation implies an in-short concept of a just war. Depravity constitutes a valid reason for dispossessing a people of its ancestral home. Let me read that again. Depravity constitutes a valid reason for dispossessing a people of its ancestral home. In this case, cultic practices and moral standards of the Amorites are well on their way to rendering the land completely contaminated. When that point is reached, but not before, conquest is permissible. Though the Torah displays a heartening sensitivity for the other here, the fate of the Amorites seems irreversible. The purpose of the detour in Egypt is to wait out the inevitable. You see, the land of Canaan was a land of perversion. Now, to understand the sin of the Amorites, you have to read Leviticus 18, 1 through 18. I won't read that here. It's very graphic, and it's not an easy read. So I encourage you to maybe go ahead and stop the video, go ahead and look up this passage, and I'll just warn you ahead of time, though, that it's tough. It's not an easy passage to read through because of the graphic nature of the sins of the Amorites. Now, because of this perversion and debauchery, God used the nation of Israel as the instrument of God's judgment against the Amorites. And in giving the land of Canaan to the Israelites, God wanted them to totally wipe out the Amorites. Now, these are the events that serve as the background for the giving of the law of Moses. It was after the Exodus from Egypt that God would establish his covenant with this nation called Israel, this nation that had grown from a small family to a powerful nation while living in the land of Egypt. So the Mosaic covenant is very extensive. It's very detailed. And it's covered in the Torah, or the Old Testament, beginning in Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, and it continues through the end of the book of Deuteronomy. Now, as with all of the covenants, the first thing we want to determine is who are the participants. Well, the participants in the Mosaic covenant are God and Israel. Now, this covenant is made with Israel, not merely with Moses, who would be acting as a representative head of Israel. It's unlike the Adamic covenant or the Noahic covenant or the Abrahamic covenant, where these are standing as representative head of the entire world. Here we have this covenant with God and Moses, and he is a representative head not of the entire world, but only of Israel. So let's read the following passages. Let's read Exodus 19, verses 3 through 8. It says, "And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel." Now, the house of Jacob and the children of Israel are the same. "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, these are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel." So Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before them all these words which the Lord had commanded. Then all the people answered together and said, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." So they accept the conditions of this covenant. So Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. Now, let's also read Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 7 through 8. Beginning in verse 7, "For what great nation is there that that has God so near to it, as the Lord our God is to us? For whatever reason we may call upon him. And what great nation is there that has such statutes and righteous judgments as are in all this law which I set before you this day?" Now, Psalm 147, 19 through 20 also states the unique relationship between God and the nation of Israel. Verse 19, "He declares his word to Jacob, his statutes and his judgments to Israel. He has not dealt thus with any nation, and as for his judgments, they have not known them. Praise the Lord." And then lastly, Malachi 4:4 says, "Remember the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and judgments." So, though we've established here the participants. And the participants of the covenant are, again, God and the nation of Israel. So this is a bilateral covenant, meaning that there are conditions, and the formula would be, I will if you will. All right. So the next thing we're going to look at are the provisions of the covenant. But because of the extensive material, obviously this covers several books of the Old Testament, I want to divide this up into simply 7 observations concerning the law or concerning this covenant. Now, the first observation is the totality of the law. You see, in the Mosaic covenant, there are 613 specific commandments or provisions in this covenant, not just what we're familiar with, the 10 Commandments. There are 365 negative commands, or don'ts, and there are 248 positive commands, or do's. Now, the law includes several divisions, or in several categories, if you would. The first is, obviously, it contains the 10 Commandments. It also contains the moral laws regarding the moral quality and character of the nation of Israel. It also had social laws, how Israel was to deal with their neighbors. It had laws regarding food or their dietary requirements. It had laws regarding purity, and we might even call that sanitation, if you would. Then there are the feast days that are discussed in the law. Also, sacrifices and offerings are discussed in the law of Moses, with instructions for the priesthood, for the high priest, and for the giving of offerings. Also, there is instruction for building the tabernacle, which would later be applied those instructions would be applied to the temple. And then finally, there were instructions that looked toward the time when Israel would beg God for a king. Now, the book of James shows us the totality of the law, and that if we break one law, we are guilty of all. James chapter 2, beginning with verse 8, says this: If you really fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You do well. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumble in one point, he is guilty of all. For he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. Now, if you don't commit adultery, but you do murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So you see, it's not a pick and choose category. If we break one law, we have broken them all. So the law shows us that we are sinners, incapable of the righteousness that is required to restore the relationship that was broken when Adam sinned in the garden. The second observation I'd like to call to your attention this morning is that there are blessings and judgments associated with this covenant, associated with the obedience or disobedience to the law. So as we mentioned earlier, this is a conditional covenant or a bilateral covenant, the formula being, I will if you will. Now, there are blessings for obedience and judgment for disobedience. Again, Exodus 19, verses 3 through 8. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, You've seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure. You see the condition? Obey my voice, keep my covenant, then you will be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, as he said in verse 5, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So Moses came, called the elders of the people, and laid this all out before them. And in verse 8 it says, Then all the people answered together and said, We accept. We're going to sign. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So Moses brought those words of the people back to the Lord. So there are blessings for being obedient to the law. But what about the curses? Leviticus 26, verses 14 through 16, we find these words, beginning with verse 14. The Lord said, If you will not obey my commands, you will be punished. If you refuse to obey my laws and commands and break the covenant I have made with you, I will punish you. I will bring disaster on you, incurable diseases, and fevers that will make you blind and cause your life to waste away. Now, the third observation is that in this covenant we now have blood sacrifice added as a requirement of the law. Now, blood sacrifices were given prior to this time, but it was not a requirement of law. It was done as a special observation. Now, this is really the key element of the Mosaic law. So I want to refer you to Leviticus 17, verse 11, and let you read that passage for yourself. And then I want you to look at Leviticus chapters 1 through 7. And in those chapters, you'll find that there are 5 different offerings that involve sacrifice. Now, as you read that, you're going to see that there's a key word, and the key word is atonement. The Hebrew word for atonement means to cover sin. While the blood of animals covered sins of the Old Testament saints, it did not take those sins away. Only the blood of Messiah can remove sin. Now here I'd like you to stop the video, and I'd like you to turn to the book of Hebrews and read chapter 10, because that gives a very clear explanation as to how the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. Only the shed blood of Messiah, God's sacrifice, could take away our sin. So the issue in our salvation is not sin itself, because sin was removed. Sin was taken care of by the death of Christ on the cross. The issue in salvation is what we do about Jesus, what we believe regarding him and what he did for us. So the blood of sacrifice did not provide the Old Testament saints with forgiveness of sin either. But it did provide the Old Testament saints with the forgiveness of sin and a restoration of fellowship for a time, but it had to be redone every single year. Whereas with the blood of Christ, it's a once-for-all sacrifice, not just for the nation of Israel, but for all people. Now, the fourth observation is that now there are some diet restrictions that are imposed. After the Noahic covenant, God said man could eat of all animals, of all vegetables. The only restriction was not eating the blood. For the Jews, restrictions are now added that were once given in the Noahic covenant. And the additions are, first of all, beasts had to be cloven-hoofed and chewed the cud. Now, a cow's a good example of a beast that has a cloven hoof, or two toes, basically two toes, and it chews the cud. Now, a pig has a cloven hoof, but it doesn't chew the cud. It's a scavenger, so that's why pork is forbidden in the Jewish diet. Now, fish were also restricted. They had to be fish with fins and scales, so catfish would have been out. Fowls, no bird of prey could be eaten. So eagles were not eaten, nor were vultures. Then finally, insects, only one type of locust is permitted for the Jewish diet. So these restrictions were added to the Jewish diet, and many have asked why these particular restrictions, and I see in there pretty much a medicinal reason, a dietary restriction, because you'll notice there that none of these animals were scavengers. And a scavenger carried disease. And so in order to prevent certain diseases, you simply just don't eat the foods that could bring on those diseases. So it makes a lot of sense. Now, the fifth observation is that the death penalty that was established in the Noahic covenant is now expanded in the Mosaic covenant. In the Noahic covenant, if you shed blood, if you killed someone, then capital punishment was to be the result. But now in the Mosaic covenant, there are several other things that would bring about the death penalty or capital punishment. Those include, in the Mosaic covenant, idolatry, adultery. Boy, folks, if we could issue the capital punishment for adultery today, I'm afraid there wouldn't be too many folks left. Also, cursing God was a capital offense. Cursing parents was a capital offense. Now, just those first four would pretty well wipe out our nation today. Breaking the Sabbath was a capital offense. Witchcraft was a capital offense. And there are many other capital offenses that are outlined in the Mosaic covenant. Now, the sixth observation is that Jews were given a sign that was associated or to be associated with the covenant. Now, this sign reaffirmed the practice of circumcision, and you'll need to read that in Leviticus 12 and verse 3. Now, why circumcision? Well, number one, this was a submission or an act of submission to the law of Moses. So it was an act of obedience. Secondly, it was mandatory for all Jews and any Gentile who wished to become part of the Commonwealth of Israel. So any Gentile that wanted to convert to Judaism had to submit to circumcision. And thirdly, and I think most important of all, this act of circumcision was to be a reminder of the miracle birth of Isaac, and that this great nation of Israel is a nation created by God through a miraculous event, through a miraculous birth of a child to a couple that were beyond the years of childbearing. Abram was 100 years old and Sarah was 90 years old when Isaac was born, and Sarah had been barren all of those 90 years. Now, the seventh observation has to do with the token of the covenant. Now, the sign of the covenant was circumcision. The token of the covenant that is given is the Sabbath. Now, we're going to deal with the Sabbath next time. But it's important for us to remember at this point that the Mosaic covenant was a covenant between God and Israel. The Gentiles are not part of this covenant. Yet God made a promise to Abraham that all the world would be blessed through Abraham and through this nation. Now, it is in the new covenant we see this blessing. Jesus' sacrifice for the sins of all people, Jew and Gentile, is what brings about that blessing. Now, remember the words of Jesus to Nicodemus? For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever, Jew or Gentile, whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. So the question for you this morning and the issue in salvation is this: do you believe? Do you believe that Jesus is the Messiah who died on the cross, forgiving our sin, taking our penalty, and restoring the relationship, and bestowing upon us who believe his righteousness while he took in his body our sin? So until next time, shalom, shalom.